Hello, my name is Sherlock Holmes, and every story hides a truth. Welcome to my new mystery.
London, that grey and inscrutable city, was steeped in a particularly thick fog on the evening when the strange affair of the music box first presented itself to our attention. The gas lamps flickered like distant fireflies through the haze, and the familiar silhouette of Twin 21B Baker Street seemed to float in a dream of yellow mist. It was late autumn 1892. I had returned from my rounds at the Kensington Infirmary, my boots heavy with mud and my mind burdened with the quiet wariness of medicine. Holmes sat, as he so often did in such hours, by the hearth, a violin in his hands and his pipe close at hand. He was playing softly, some mournful strain that seemed half memory, half improvisation, when the bell downstairs rang sharply, shattering the mood. "Messieurs, Hudson is not likely to entertain visitors at this hour," I remarked, removing my gloves. Holmes's bow froze mid-note. His gray eyes flicked toward me, gleaming with a peculiar light. "On the contrary, my dear Watson, I have been expecting one for some days." Expecting? But how? Before I could finish, Mrs. Hudson entered, holding a small parcel upon a silver tray. The paper was crumpled, the string hastily tied, as if by trembling hands. "For you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice uncertain. "It came by private courier. No sender's name." Holmes took it with a curt nod. He examined the handwriting upon the wrapper, then the faint smudge of red near the knot. "Interesting," he murmured. "You perceive this discoloration, Watson? Wax, perhaps." He raised the parcel to his nose and inhaled lightly. No blood. A chill ran through me. Holmes unfastened the string and removed the paper. Within lay a small music box of fine craftsmanship, yet aged and tarnished by time. The mahogany casing bore an engraved crest, an A entwined with a thorned rose. More disquieting still, across one corner of the lid was a dark, dried smear. And then, as Holmes wound the key, a fragile melody began to play. Sweet at first, then faltering as though the mechanism itself resisted completion. The tune carried an eerily human quality, like a voice whispering through metal teeth. "Remarkable," Holmes said quietly. "Do you hear it, Watson? A waltz, but fractured, incomplete. And that rhythm unmistakable. You recognize it?" He nodded. "A rare piece. La Mélodie du Sang, composed by an obscure French musician named Ian Moreau in 1789. It was said he wrote it moments before his execution during the Revolution. An ill omen of a melody." "Then," I said, uneasily watching the box's spinning cylinder. Holmes tilted the lid, and a folded scrap of paper slid free, fluttering into his lap. Upon it, in thin, slanted handwriting, were the words, "For Holmes, the song knows the truth." Beneath a crimson fingerprint. For several moments there was only the ticking of the mantel clock and the faint echo of the music dying into silence. Holmes's face had grown grave. "Watson," he said finally, "this is no idle curiosity. That crest belongs to the Ashworth family, one of the oldest in Surrey. I recall a recent notice in the Times concerning the sudden death of Lord Edward Ashworth, officially heart failure. Unofficially." He drew a long breath of smoke, unconvincing. He rose abruptly, pacing before the fire. "Blood upon an heirloom, a melody tied to a death, and a plea to me. It is either a cruel jest or a cry for justice. And how shall we determine which, I ask? Be visiting the house to which that crest belongs." He turned to me with that peculiar energy that always seized him at the scent of a mystery. "Pack your revolver, Watson. We leave for Surrey with the morning train." The following day broke cold and dim, the fog still lingering like a veil over London's waking streets. We took the early express from Waterloo, our compartment lit faintly by the oil lamps as countryside blurred into shadowed fields beyond. Holmes sunk deep in his overcoat, had the music box on his knees, examining its mechanism with his magnifying glass. "Observe," he said, adjusting the lens. "The bloodstain is not random. It has flowed from a small puncture in the wood near the hinge. A wound, one might say, inflicted upon the box. Surely that is fanciful," I protested. "Nothing is fanciful where evidence speaks," he replied. "This blood is not more than a few months old. The donor, a man, judging by the distribution, suffered a cut finger or worse at the time of winding or sealing it." He closed the lid with a soft snap. "There is also a faint odor, not of age, but of sea, salt, and lilac oil, a woman's perfume mingled with travel. Then we seek a lady from the sea." He smiled thinly, "Perhaps. Or a lady who wishes us to think so." By afternoon we reached Ashworth Manor, a brooding edifice of dark stone and ivy, set upon a hill above the Surrey marshes. The air hung heavy with damp and silence. Only the distant caw of crows disturbed it. A tall footman received us, his expression impassive when Holmes presented his card. After a moment's delay, we were ushered through a hall lined with portraits. Stern faces of long, dead Ashworths watching us as though judging trespassers. Lady Beatrice Ashworth awaited us in a drawing-room filled with fading grandeur. She was perhaps 35, strikingly pale, her dark hair drawn in elegant restraint. Mourning black suited her almost too well. Holmes, she said softly, her eyes lingering on the music box. You have received the parcel? Indeed, madam? I presume you sent it? A pause, then a slow shake of the head. No, but I feared I might be connected to it. Holmes inclined his head slightly. How so? She turned away, gazing toward the window where rain streaked the glass. That music box belonged to my late husband. It was found beside him the night he died. The silence that followed seemed to thicken with the fog pressing against the panes. Watson's heart, that is, my own, gave a slow, uneasy beat. Holmes's voice was calm, but his eyes burned. Pray, Lady Ashworth, recount precisely how your husband met his end. Her fingers trembled upon the armrest. He was found in his study. The door locked from within. No wound upon him, yet blood upon the desk. His own, the doctor said, though no cause was found. The only sound anyone heard that night, she whispered, was the tune of that music box. Holmes lifted it slightly, as if weighing its significance. And since his death, she hesitated. It plays sometimes at night. On its own, outside, thunder rolled distantly over the marshes. The sound mingled with her words like an omen. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the hallway shadows. Watson, he murmured, I believe we have arrived at the overture of a most curious symphony. There is a peculiar silence that only great country houses possess. Not the peaceful stillness of solitude, but the heavy quiet of long-kept secrets. Ashworth Manor was of that breed. Its corridors seemed to breathe faint draughts of the past. Portraits watched from the shadows with the melancholy patience of centuries. Lady Beatrice led us through a maze of dimly lit halls until we reached the late Lord Ashworth's study, a tall oak-paneled chamber whose single window overlooked the fog-choked gardens below. The curtains, half drawn, let in only a sickly gray light, and I could feel the damp chill of the place even through my coat. This was where he died, she said softly. Exactly 1 year ago this week. Holmes stood in the center of the room, surveying it with the alert stillness of a hawk. His eyes missed nothing. The soot on the hearth, the faint scuff marks near the desk, the small dark stain in the carpet where, no doubt, blood had once been. You have left it untouched, he observed, almost entirely. I could not bring myself to alter anything. It feels improper. Holmes nodded slowly. And the door? You said it was locked. Yes, from the inside. My husband was found seated at his desk, the key still in his pocket. Holmes's thin fingers traced the edge of the writing table. Extraordinary. He crouched, running a gloved hand beneath the drawers, then rose and turned to the window. The latch was rusted but intact. He unlatched it and pushed gently. It opened with a faint groan. Watson, observe. The window is large enough for a man to enter, but the sill bears no scratches, no mud, no sign of forced passage. Whoever was here left no trace, or knew well how to remove it. Then it was suicide, I asked. Holmes's lip curled faintly. My dear fellow, men seldom die from music. No, this was no self-inflicted death. He moved toward a glass case beside the bookshelf within which lay several curios, medals, an ivory-handled pistol, and a few musical trinkets. Among them, a violin string snapped. Holmes bent closer. Catgut, recently broken. Lady Beatrice looked away quickly. Edward was fond of music. He often played his violin late into the night. Until the night it played him a tune in return. Holmes murmured. At Holmes's request, Lady Beatrice rang for the butler, a stiff, aging man named Hollins. His face bore the weary patience of one who had served too many masters and buried more than one. Hollins, Holmes said pleasantly. You were in service here on the night of your master's death. Yes, sir. 30 years I've been here. I found him myself, God rest him. Describe what you saw. The old man's voice trembled. He was sitting at the desk, sir. Like this. He gestured weakly. Head on his arm, the box there beside him, still playing that dreadful tune. Blood on his fingers, but no wound that the doctor could find. Was anyone else awake? Only Lady Beatrice, sir. She'd rung earlier, but when I went to her room she said it was nothing. The next thing I knew she was crying for help. Holmes's gaze flicked briefly toward Lady Beatrice. And you heard the music box playing before you found him? Yes, sir. It was faint but unnatural somehow. I've heard it since too. When there's no one near it. Holmes inclined his head gravely. That will be all, Hollins. The butler withdrew, and the air seemed to tighten once more around us. When we were alone again, Lady Beatrice stood by the fire, the light casting her face into a portrait of shadows and sorrow. You must think me a foolish woman, she said quietly. Haunted by tunes and ghosts? Not at all, Holmes replied. You are haunted by memory, a far more credible specter. Now tell me, Lady Ashworth, had your husband any enemies? Her gaze hardened. My husband made enemies as easily as others make acquaintances. He was difficult, ambitious. He had financial dealings I did not understand, and corresponded with men I distrusted. Anyone of note. She hesitated. A man named Crane, Elias Crane, a craftsman from the East End who built that music box. My husband commissioned it shortly before his death. Holmes's interest sharpened. And for what purpose? I never knew, but it obsessed him. He said the box was to contain a secret. His masterpiece of deception, he called it. He would lock himself in here for hours, winding it over and over. Holmes exchanged a look with me. A secret and sound intriguing. After Lady Beatrice excused herself, Holmes remained in the study, pacing slowly. I stood near the hearth, the faint wail of wind outside carrying an echo of that cursed melody in my imagination. You believe there is a connection between this Elias Crane and the death? I ask. I believe Crane holds the key, perhaps literally. You recall the inscription upon the note. The song knows the truth. He paused, lighting his pipe. That implies the truth has been concealed within the melody itself. But how could such a thing be possible? Through cipher, rhythm, and structure. Music can speak to the trained mind as words do to the linguist. There may be a code, a message hidden within the tune. He leaned against the desk, eyes distant. Watson, I mean to hear that melody again, properly, tonight. The evening deepened into darkness, and a storm swept over the Surrey marshes. The manor's ancient timbers creaked as wind clawed at the eaves. Holmes had the music box placed upon the table between us, a single candle casting long, trembling shadows. Lady Beatrice had long since retired, and the servants kept to their quarters, leaving the house silent save for the distant patter of rain. Holmes wound the key slowly. The melody began. At first it was sweet, delicate, almost tender. Then it faltered, skipping a note, repeating another, as though caught in a loop of hesitation. The tone turned mournful, discordant, like a lament that could not find its ending. Holmes closed his eyes, head tilted. I watched the subtle shift in his expression, the concentration, the recognition. There, do you hear it, Watson? A pattern of 4s followed by 3s, then 2s. It is Morse, musical Morse. I listened intently, but could make little sense of it. He tapped his fingers upon the desk in rhythm with the tune, murmuring under his breath. O-R. He stopped abruptly. Floor, he said aloud. The message spells floored. Before I could respond, there came a soft click, not from the box but beneath it. Holmes lifted the object swiftly and pressed upon the panel of the desk where it had rested. A small compartment slid open with a muted creak. Within lay a scrap of faded paper, folded once. Holmes unfolded it and held it to the candlelight. Scrawled in hurried ink were the words, "The blood beneath the floor must not be found." A shiver ran through me. Holmes's eyes glittered. "Watson," he said quietly, "I believe we have just heard the voice of a dead man." The storm thundered overhead, shaking the glass, and in that moment the music box played one final discordant note, sharp, metallic, and terribly human. I have seen Holmes in many moods. The mercurial brilliance of discovery, the austere silence of analysis, the grim satisfaction of conclusion. But on that storm-racked night within Ashworth Manor, I saw in him something rarer, reverence. Reverence for the uncanny precision of the human mind that hides its sins in cipher and melody. He stood long before the open compartment, the slip of paper trembling slightly between his fingers in the candlelight. The words, "The blood beneath the floor must not be found," glimmered faintly where the ink had bled into the fibers, as though echoing the phrase itself. This, he murmured, was written in haste, the letters pressed so deeply the nib tore the page. A confession or a warning, but by whom? Surely by Lord Ashworth himself, I ventured, a man racked by guilt, concealing some crime beneath his very feet. Holmes shook his head. Or perhaps written to him. We must not assume the speaker and the sinner are one and the same. He straightened suddenly, every nerve alert. "Watson, fetch my lamp. I mean to see what lies beneath this carpet." I did so, the thunder outside grumbling like a discontented beast. Together we rolled back the heavy Persian rug that covered the study floor. Beneath it lay aged oak planks darkened with age and faintly warped by damp. Holmes knelt, running his fingers along the seams. "Feel here, this section near the desk. Slightly raised. The boards have been disturbed." He took from his case a thin, bladed knife and worked delicately at the edge. With a faint pop, one plank loosened. Beneath the hollow of a small cavity yawned blackly in the lamplight. The smell reached us at once, faint, metallic, unmistakable. "Blood," Holmes said flatly. Within the cavity lay a dark stain upon the earth, old but still distinct, and beside it something small and glinting. He retrieved it carefully with his tweezers. It was a broken cufflink, bearing the Ashworth crest. Holmes examined it, eyes narrowing. "Not Lord Ashworth's, the monogram is reversed. This belonged to another member of the family, a brother. There was one, if memory serves, Henry Ashworth, expelled from Cambridge, vanished from London years ago, a gambler, a black sheep, the sort who might return when fortune favors his name again." Holmes replaced the plank gently, then stood. "We have a corpse in symbol if not in flesh, and a stain that the earth itself refuses to forget." At dawn the storm relented. The manor, drenched and dripping, looked less like a house and more like the husk of something that had weathered too much time. Holmes was already at work in the morning room, the music box dismantled before him in surgical precision. Gears, pins, and combs were arranged in orderly rows upon a linen cloth. Lady Beatrice watched from the threshold, pale and sleepless. "I cannot bear the sight of it," she whispered. "Courage, madam," Holmes said gently. "The truth, once revealed, often proves less dreadful than the shadow of ignorance." Her gaze lingered on the blood-stained lid. "When I hear that melody, it feels as though he is still here, accusing me." "Then perhaps he is," Holmes replied, his tone so calm it chilled me. He adjusted a small gear beneath his lens. "Watson, observe this cylinder, a faint residue within the grooves." I leaned closer. "As that dried blood, precisely. The mechanism itself is contaminated. And note how it corresponds to certain notes in the sequence, as though the blood had been deliberately applied to mark specific tones." He turned to Lady Beatrice. "Do you know of anyone who might possess both knowledge of this composition and cause to conceal a message within it?" She hesitated, her hands twisting the edge of her sleeve. "There was a man who often visited Edward in those months before his death. Professor Arthur Lytton, a scholar of music at King's College. He spoke of hidden harmonics and musical ciphers. My husband found his theories fascinating." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "An academic with a taste for cryptic melody, just the mind to craft such a riddle." By midday, we were on the train back to London, the music box carefully secured in Holmes's valise. The air was clearer now, but a grim tension hung between us like smoke. Holmes sat motionless, fingers steepled, eyes half closed in thought. The rhythm of the train seemed to beat time to his deductions. At length he spoke. "Watson, we have 3 strands, a melody that encodes a message, a note warning of blood beneath the floor, and a craftsman named Crane who fashioned the device. Between them lies the truth. Lytton may provide the thread to bind them." He paused, then smiled faintly. "And perhaps also, a motive that sings. We found Professor Arthur Lytton at his rooms in Bloomsbury, a spare and nervy man with long fingers stained by ink and rosin. He welcomed us with distracted politeness, though his eyes darted frequently toward the music box in Holmes's hands. "The Ashworth Commission," he said almost hungrily. "A fascinating specimen. I assisted briefly with its harmonic structure. Lord Ashworth desired something unique, a melody that concealed both mathematical and emotional significance. He fancied himself a man of science as well as sentiment." Holmes set the box upon Lytton's table. "You knew, then, that it might serve to encode a message?" The professor hesitated. "In theory, yes. The arrangement of notes could correspond to letters, numbers, even dates. But I did not know he intended to use it so." "Did he ever mention a man named Elias Crane?" A shadow crossed Lytton's face. "Crane, yes, the craftsman. A genius, but unstable. He suffered an accident some years ago, lost 2 fingers in his right hand. It made him bitter, suspicious. He and Lord Ashworth quarreled before the instrument was completed." "Over what? Payment, perhaps. Or conscience, I cannot say." Holmes studied him keenly. "Professor, you are trembling. Why?" Lytton swallowed. "Because, Mr. Holmes, that melody, it should not exist. There is something wrong in its structure. It repeats intervals that disturb the ear. Some say such patterns can affect the mind. I have dreamt it every night since we composed it." His voice faltered. "And last week, someone broke into my study. They took my notes. Every page concerning the Ashworth cipher." Holmes's expression hardened. "When precisely?" "The night before last." That evening, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. The fog had thickened once more, swallowing the lamps into dim halos. Holmes was unusually quiet. He sat before the fire, the music box open on the table, its tune whispering faintly through the room. Suddenly, he stopped at mid-phrase. "Watson, I fear we are no longer the hunters in this game, but the prey." "How so?" "Because someone else seeks what we now possess, and they kill to keep it secret." Before I could respond, there came a sharp rap upon the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, pale and breathless. "Mr. Holmes, a messenger. He's just come from King's College. Professor Lytton. He's been found dead." Holmes was on his feet in an instant. "How?" She swallowed, throat cut and the music box tune playing on a gramophone beside him. The fire hissed softly as Holmes's shadow loomed against the wall. "The tune," he said quietly, "has claimed its second victim. There are few sights more unnerving than the morgue at dawn, that pale hour when the city has not yet awakened and the dead seem to own London." The gas jets hissed faintly above their steel tables, throwing long shadows upon the whitewashed walls. It was there, in the chill stillness of that place, that Holmes and I stood beside the lifeless form of Professor Arthur Lytton. The coroner, a portly fellow with the unfortunate cheerfulness of long habit, gestured toward the body. "Clean incision, gentlemen. A professional hand, if you ask me. No sign of struggle. He bled to death in under a minute." Holmes leaned close, his face unreadable. "A straight cut from left to right." The killer stood behind him, tall, right-handed, decisive. He turned back the blood-stiffened collar. And see here, Watson, a faint mark upon the wrist. Rope burn, he was restrained before death. Then it was murder, beyond doubt. Indeed, but observe the faint residue upon his fingertips. I looked. There, smudged faintly beneath the nails, was a reddish-brown dust. Rust, I suggested. Holmes shook his head. Dried blood and powdered iron. The same scent I detected upon the music box's cylinder. Our murderer is consistent. He straightened, folding his arms. And more than that, he is close. Lytton's killer was not merely silencing him, he was retrieving something. The missing notes. And we returned to Baker Street with the wariness that only death and fog can bring. Yet Holmes's mind was aflame. He paced before the fire, his long shadow stretching and shrinking with every flicker of flame. The cipher, Watson. The cipher is everything. Lytton said the melody hides meaning. Let us, then, make it speak. He brought forth his violin, tuning it with swift precision. Then, opening his notebook, he began to play the melody of the music box, slowly, note by note, transcribing its structure upon the page. The sound filled the room, haunting, uneven, beautiful in its imperfection. When he finished, he sat back, tapping the quill against his lip. There the irregularities. Every seventh note deviates from the harmonic scale. Each of these corresponds to a letter if we map it to the solfege positions. I watched as he marked letters across the score. Slowly, a phrase began to emerge. Bilbode bin t balaram. Holmes exhaled sharply. The floor in the study was but a prelude, Watson. The real burial lies elsewhere, beneath the ballroom at Ashworth Manor. Precisely. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Then what was under the study floor? He smiled thinly. A decoy, a symphonic misdirection. Before evening, we were again en route to Surrey, the countryside rolling by under a sky bruised with approaching storm. Lady Beatrice received us at the door, her expression taut with dread. More questions, Mr. Holmes. More answers, I hope, Lady Ashworth. I must request access to your ballroom. She stared. The ballroom. But it has not been used since before my husband's death. Then it is time it was. Holmes said simply. The ballroom of Ashworth Manor was a vast, echoing chamber lined with mirrors and faded silk drapery. Dust lay thick upon the parquet floor, and the great chandelier hung like a frozen constellation overhead. Holmes stood in the center, listening, truly listening, to the air. Then, to my astonishment, he began to pace slowly in a spiral, tapping the floor with his cane at measured intervals. Tap, tap, tap. At the 12th step, the sound changed, hollow, resonant. Holmes knelt immediately, brushing aside the dust. Here, Watson. The boards are newer, replaced within the year. Lady Beatrice stood near the doorway, her face pale. That section was repaired after Edward's death. Termite damage, the carpenter said. Holmes arched a brow. Termites or truth. He took a crowbar from his case. For Holmes traveled as a soldier might into battle, and set to work. The wood yielded with a reluctant groan. Beneath it, darkness. Holmes lowered his lantern. The light fell upon something wrapped in rotted canvas. A shape unmistakable even to the untrained eye. A body, I whispered. Holmes nodded grimly. And not Lord Ashworth's. We uncovered enough to see the remains of a man, his skull fractured, a rusted chain about his neck. Upon his wrist gleamed the mate to the broken cufflink we had found. Holmes turned to Lady Beatrice, who had sunk against the wall, her hand over her mouth. Madam, he said softly, this man was buried here. You knew nothing of this. She shook her head wildly.
No, I swear it.
Who is he? Your husband's brother, Henry Ashworth. Murdered, I would say, several months before your husband's own death. The silence that followed was immense. Only the ticking of the great clock broke it. Holmes's face was grave. Your husband killed his brother, and then someone killed him to silence that secret. This is a chain of blood, each link forged in deceit. That night, back in our guest chamber, Holmes sat by the window gazing into the fog-wrapped gardens. You saw her reaction, Watson?
Yes.
Genuine terror, precisely. She did not know of the body. Therefore, she is not the architect of this crime. But someone in that house is. He tapped the music box thoughtfully. Henry's death was the first note in this composition. Edward concealed it, encoding his guilt in the melody. Perhaps as penance, perhaps as protection. But someone discovered it. Someone who feared exposure. And Lytton, killed for decoding what we now know. And Crane, the craftsman, he alone remains who can tell us why this box was built to bleed. At that moment, a knock sounded at the door. It was Hollins the butler, his face pale as tallow. Beg pardon, sir. A letter has just arrived. It bears your name, Mr. Holmes. Holmes took it, broke the seal, and unfolded the note. I saw the color drain from his face. It read that you seek the craftsman. He is already dead. Stop the song before it reaches its final verse, or it will claim her too. No signature, only a faint stain of crimson upon the paper's edge. Holmes stared at it for a long moment, then spoke very quietly. Watson, We return to London at once. Elias Crane may yet speak, but only from the grave. No man can return from a night such as that at Ashworth Manor unchanged. The storm had passed by the time Holmes and I boarded the early train for London, yet its echo seemed to travel with us. The landscape, bathed in a grey dawn, blurred past the window like ghosts retreating into mist. Holmes sat opposite me, hands clasped, eyes fixed upon the rhythm of the wheels, as though every turn drew him closer to some hidden pattern in the case. At length he said, almost absently, "We stand now upon the threshold of revelation, Watson, and the ground beneath us is blood." I made no reply. The memory of that corpse beneath the ballroom floor was still too vivid, too human. We arrived in London under a cold rain and went straight to the records office in Chancery Lane. Holmes's connections, as always, opened doors where others found only keys. By noon, a dusty clerk had produced for us a stack of ledgers. Among them Holmes found what he sought, a death certificate for one Elias Crane, dated but a week prior. Cause asphyxiation, suicide by hanging. Holmes's brow darkened. Suicide? How convenient. The clerk, startled, stammered. The body was found in a workshop in Limehouse. No family to claim it. The police closed the matter quickly. Did they indeed? Holmes murmured. He turned to me. Watson, we go to Limehouse. The dead may yet speak, if one knows how to listen. A Crane's workshop lay at the far end of a narrow alley off the river, where the fog hung thick and foul with the odor of salt and decay. The door stood half ajar, and within the gloom of the place seemed alive with silence. Holmes entered without hesitation. The interior was a chaos of half-finished instruments, cogs, gears, and springs, all strewn with the dust of abandonment. The faint glimmer of copper and brass gave the room a mechanical melancholy, as though its master had left mid-creation and would return no more. "Observe," Holmes said softly, pointing to a stool near the workbench. "The rope mark upon that beam corresponds to the supposed suicide. Yet, note the distance from stool to noose. I measured it by eye. Too far. He could not have reached it unaided. Precisely. Crane did not hang himself." Holmes bent to examine the floor. A smear of rust-colored residue ran toward a corner where a small fire grate stood cold. He sifted the ashes with his gloved hand, revealing fragments of paper, and among them, a melted lump of wax bearing the faint impression of the Ashworth crest. "Watson, the evidence is unmistakable." Crane was silenced after attempting to destroy his remaining correspondence with Lord Ashworth. From a drawer in the workbench, Holmes drew forth a small wooden case, its lock forced. Inside lay a bundle of blueprints, sketches of the music box, annotated in a trembling hand. One page was marked, "Madouche. Commission cancelled." "Model?" I asked. Holmes nodded grimly. Frayne built a second box, perhaps a duplicate, perhaps an improvement, and someone feared it. He turned over the last sheet, revealing a brief scrawl across the margin. "The melody binds him still. The blood is not his own." Holmes's jaw tightened. "Watson, I believe we are dealing with an act of double murder, and a message encoded in blood itself." That night, back in Baker Street, Holmes worked with feverish energy. He spread Crane's papers across the table, aligning them beside his own transcriptions of the melody. Tobacco smoke thickened the air, and the fire glowed red upon his sharp features. The phrase "the blood is not his own." It suggests a substitution, a deception. Edward Ashworth killed his brother Henry, concealed the body beneath the ballroom, and later, when conscience began to gnaw, he bled upon the mechanism himself, perhaps to symbolize his guilt. But then who killed him? I asked. That, my dear Watson, is the central refrain of this grim symphony. He lifted a magnifying lens and examined the bloodstain upon the lid of the music box once more. This mark. I had it tested this afternoon. 2 distinct blood types, one belonging to a man of middle years, the other to a woman. A woman. Yes. And I can think of only one who might have touched this object often enough to leave such trace. I stared at him. Lady Beatrice. Holmes's eyes glittered. So it would seem, yet whether by guilt or by grief I cannot yet tell. The following day we returned once more to Surrey, our purpose grim. The police, under Holmes's quiet persuasion, had agreed to excavate beneath the ballroom floor. The remains of Henry Ashworth were removed and examined under the county coroner's supervision. The cause of death was confirmed, a violent blow to the skull. The chain around his neck had been used to drag him to his hiding place. Lady Beatrice was present at the inquiry, her face white as marble. When the verdict was read, she swayed and would have fallen had I not caught her. Holmes, standing beside the magistrate, remained outwardly composed, but I knew him well enough to read the tempest behind his stillness. As the inquest closed, Lady Beatrice approached us. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "the house, it will never rest now. I hear that tune every night. Last evening, though the box is locked away, it played again, faintly, from somewhere below." Holmes studied her intently.
"Below, you say?" "Yes, from the cellar, I think."
Holmes turned sharply to me. "Watson." "Lanterns. We go now." The manor's cellar was vast and damp, a labyrinth of stone vaults and forgotten storerooms. The air was cold as a tomb. Our lanterns cast circles of trembling light upon the walls, revealing cobwebs thick as lace. Holmes moved methodically, tapping, listening. Then he froze. From the far corner came a faint, metallic chime, a single phrase of that cursed melody. He strode forward and tore aside a rotting curtain. There, upon an old crate, sat another music box, identical to the first, save that its lid was closed and its surface unblemished. "Motto," he whispered. Crane's second creation. He wound it cautiously. The melody that emerged was slower, deeper, the same waltz but inverted, its phrases reversed. Midway through, a harsh rasp broke the tune. Holmes opened the lid and pried beneath the cylinder. Something small fell into his hand, a signet ring, smeared with dried blood. He wiped it clean. Upon its face was engraved the crest of the Ashworth, and inside the initials E.A., Howard Ashworth. I breathed then.
Les.
Holmes said quietly. His own ring, hidden within the twin box. This is his confession, a posthumous testament. He knew death was coming and sought to leave proof of his guilt. But someone found this second box before us. He glanced toward the stairs, and that someone now knows we have found it too. At that moment, a faint sound reached us, the creak of a floorboard above. Holmes extinguished his lantern instantly, plunging us into darkness. We waited. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, descended the stone stair. A silhouette appeared at the edge of the lamplight, tall, lean, a pistol glinting in one hand. "Stay where you are, Mr. Holmes," said a cold, familiar voice. It was Hollins, the butler. For a moment no one spoke. The faint light from his lantern gleamed upon the metal of the revolver. Holmes's tone when he spoke was almost courteous. "So, Mr. Hollins, the final act begins." The old man's face twisted. "You should have left it buried. None of you understand. I served him, both of them, and I cleaned their sins with my own hands. You killed Henry," Holmes said evenly. "And when Edward faltered, you killed him too. You've been playing the melody ever since to keep the ghosts at bay." The butler's eyes flashed. "He ordered me to. Edward made me hide the body, promised it would all be forgotten. But then he began to talk in his sleep, to speak of confession, of the tune that would tell the world. I couldn't let him ruin her. My lady, she's pure. I did what I had to." His hand trembled upon the pistol. Holmes took a slow step forward. "You loved her, didn't you, Hollins?" The man's breath caught. "She was kind. She smiled at me. I couldn't let her hang for his sins." For a heartbeat, the air seemed to still. Then, as if some inner string had snapped, Hollins turned the pistol upon himself. The shot echoed through the cellar like the last note of a requiem. Holmes knelt beside the fallen man, his expression unreadable, a servant's loyalty perverted by guilt. The truest tragedy of all, he turned the second music box in his hand. 2 boxes, 2 songs, one of confession, one of concealment. Edward's music was meant to reveal the truth. Hollins's silence turned it into death. We left the cellar in silence. Behind us, the boxes lay still, their melodies finally spent. The events of that night left an indelible mark upon my spirit. The image of poor Hollins lying motionless upon the cold stones haunted me for many nights thereafter. Yet, as ever, Holmes regarded even death as but one more datum in the great equation of truth. By morning the constables had cleared the cellar, and the 2 music boxes, those infernal twins, lay sealed in evidence crates. Holmes declined to return with the police to Scotland Yard. Instead, he remained at Ashworth Manor, pacing the drawing room in long, silent strides, his violin resting untouched upon the mantelpiece. Lady Beatrice had withdrawn to her chambers after the shooting, and I feared the shock might have undone her entirely. When I mentioned my concern, Holmes merely said, "Grief, Watson, is the most eloquent of disguises." There was in his voice a tone I had learned to dread, that cold certainty preceding revelation. We dined that evening by candlelight, the house draped in uneasy silence. Lady Beatrice joined us, pale and tremulous, her mourning gown lending her an air of spectral beauty. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "the horror of last night, I cannot think of it without trembling. Hollins was loyal to my husband. If he did such dreadful things, it must have been from love, not malice." Holmes inclined his head. "Love is often the seed of the gravest sins, my lady. You have my condolences, and my respect for your courage. I feel none, only guilt." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And what form, may I ask, does that guilt take?" Her hands twisted the lace of her handkerchief. "I brought the box here. It should have remained in London. I thought perhaps by destroying it, I might destroy the memories it carried. You sent it to Baker Street," Holmes said quietly. "In your own name, yet unsigned. You wished me to find the truth for you, or to bury it." A silence fell heavy between them. The fire snapped, and the faint tick of the clock was the only sound. Then she whispered, "I wished only for peace." Holmes rose. "Then let us find it together. Tomorrow night I shall hold a small gathering, a musical evening if you will." the final movement of this melancholy symphony. The following day was spent in preparation. Holmes arranged for a piano to be tuned, the surviving guests of the Ashworth circle invited, a few local acquaintances, the magistrate, and the constable who had overseen the inquest. To them, the invitation promised nothing more than a recital in memory of the late Lord and Lady Ashworth's husband. To me, it was clear that Holmes was setting his stage. "Holmes," I said as we walked along the terrace that afternoon, "is it wise to subject Lady Beatrice to such a scene?" He stopped, the autumn wind stirring his coat. "If she is innocent, the truth will free her. If not, it will condemn her. The melody itself shall decide." There was an odd solemnity in his tone, almost reverent. That evening, the guests assembled in the great drawing room. The chandeliers cast their golden glow upon the gathered company, whose murmured conversations fell to silence when Holmes entered, bearing the first music box. He placed it upon a polished table beside the piano. Lady Beatrice, veiled in black lace, stood by the hearth, her posture rigid. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, his voice calm and clear, "we meet tonight not merely to remember, but to understand. This music box, once belonging to the late Lord Ashworth, holds within it a secret, one composed not in notes but in conscience. We shall play it once more, as it was meant to be heard." He opened the lid. The familiar waltz began, haunting, delicate, its melody rising and falling like a voice from beyond the grave. At first Lady Beatrice stood still. Then, as the refrain repeated, her hands trembled. Her gaze fixed upon the spinning cylinder with a kind of horror, as though each note struck her heart. When the final bar faded, she cried out sharply, "Stop it! Stop that infernal song!" and turned away, hiding her face in her hands. Holmes closed the lid with quiet finality. "You recognize it, then, my lady?" "Of course I do," she sobbed. "He wrote it for me. Edward wrote it the year we married. It was our waltz." "Indeed," Holmes said softly, "and yet this particular arrangement contains a hidden motive, a phrase only recently added, a confession woven into the music itself." She looked up, bewildered. "A confession?" Holmes gestured toward the piano. "Watson, if you please." I took my place, though my fingers were uncertain. Holmes handed me the transcribed sheet of notes, marked with crimson annotations. "Play this exactly as written." I did so, haltingly at first, then with growing comprehension. The melody was the same, yet something within it had shifted. Its once lilting grace now carried dissonance, its harmony breaking into sudden, painful clashes. When the final chord rang out, Holmes said, "These discordant phrases, when translated by musical cipher, spell words. Words that say, 'Forgive me, Beatrice.'" A gasp ran through the room. Lady Beatrice stared at him, stricken. "That cannot be. He never." Holmes stepped closer. "He did. Edward knew his end was near. He sought absolution not from the world but from you. You were not merely his wife, Lady Beatrice. You were his judge." Her lips trembled. "Then why did he die?" "Because someone feared his confession would destroy them," Holmes said. "Hollands carried out the act, but not by his own design. He obeyed the will of another." All eyes turned toward Lady Beatrice. She rose unsteadily, her veil trembling. "You mean me?" Holmes's voice was low, almost tender. "Yes. You may not have struck the blow, but it was you who whispered the command." Her breath caught, and then she laughed, a sound brittle as glass. "You think me capable of such horror?" "I think you capable of desperation," Holmes replied. "A woman trapped in a loveless union, fearful of scandal, surrounded by secrets. When Edward confessed his crime, the murder of his brother Henry, you feared exposure more than sin. You begged Hollands to silence him, believing only then could your name remain unblemished." Her eyes filled with tears. "And yet you speak of me as though I were a monster." Holmes's tone softened. "No, my lady. Merely human." The room had fallen into complete stillness. The guests looked on, pale and silent. Holmes turned toward me. "Watson, fetch the second box." I did so, bringing forth the duplicate from its crate. Holmes wound it once, and let it play. This version of the tune was deeper, slower, mournful, a requiem to its own twin. Halfway through it faltered, the mechanism catching. Holmes lifted the lid and drew from within a folded scrap of paper. He handed it to Lady Beatrice. "His final note, found within this second box. Read it, if you will." Her hands shook as she unfolded the fragile page. "I cannot bear the sound of her silence. Let my song tell her the truth. Forgive me, Beatrice, for the blood that stains our waltz." Her face crumpled. He meant to tell me. All along." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "He loved you enough to leave the truth in melody, trusting that one day you would hear it with new ears." For a long while no one spoke. Lady Beatrice collapsed into her chair, the paper clutched to her breast, sobbing softly. Holmes closed both boxes, his expression unreadable. And thus ends the widow's waltz. Later, as the guests dispersed and the house returned to silence, I found Holmes alone by the fire. "You pitied her," I said quietly. He did not look up. "I understood her, Watson. That is quite different. You will not see her charged. Holmes shook his head. No, the law may punish the act, but only conscience can punish the soul, and hers is already condemned. He gazed into the flames, his voice low. There is no melody so haunting as remorse. It plays endlessly in the heart. Morning came great and cold over Ashworth Manor, the kind of pallid dawn that drains all color from the world. The storm had passed, yet its echo lingered in the restless moan of the wind through the eaves. Holmes and I took our leave shortly after breakfast. Lady Beatrice did not descend to bid us farewell. She remained secluded in her rooms, her fate now tied to her conscience. Holmes was silent for most of the carriage ride, his eyes fixed on the horizon, though I knew his mind was far from the misted countryside. At last he said, "Watson, do you recall the signature upon the blueprint recovered from Crane's workshop?" "I do. It was smudged, though you claimed to recognize the hand." "Indeed. The handwriting was not Crane's. It belonged to another, a man who, I believe, still lives." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded telegram. "I sent a wire to the Guild of Instrument Makers last night. There was once an apprentice under Elias Crane, a certain Jonathan Lytton, dismissed for theft 2 years prior." "Lytton?" I exclaimed. "The very name of the murdered music historian?" Holmes smiled faintly. "No coincidence, my dear Watson. The professor we found dead in his study was not the genuine Lytton at all." I stared at him. "Then who was he?" "A masquerader. Our missing apprentice, hiding under the identity of the man he once robbed." "Good heavens." Holmes's eyes glinted. "And he died because he attempted to sell the secret of the second box to a higher bidder. Someone discovered his deception and silenced him before he could speak." He leaned back, his voice low. "The question now is, who?" We returned to London by noon and went straight to Baker Street, where Holmes flung himself into his work with the fervor of resurrection. Papers, letters, and sketches flew from his desk as he reconstructed the chain of events. "Watson," he said, pacing before the fire, "the key lies not in the melody itself, but in who wrote it. Edward Ashworth was no composer. He could play, perhaps, but he could not create. He lacked the education, the precision, the mind for musical structure. You think Crane wrote it. Crane built the mechanism, yes, but the tune, the ciphered confession, is far too elegant for a craftsman's hand. No, there was another mind behind it. The true composer." He turned abruptly. "Fetch me the list of those who attended the Ashworth recitals during the year of his death." After some hours of research at the London Library, we uncovered a newspaper announcement, a private recital at Ashworth Manor. Guest performer Miss Clara Harbury, composer and pianist. Holmes tapped the line with satisfaction. There she is, the missing voice in our symphony. That afternoon we visited Clara Harbury at her modest Bloomsbury flat. A woman of perhaps 30 years, her dark hair streaked with gray, her fingers stained faintly with ink. Her lodgings were lined with sheet music, and a grand piano occupied the corner like an altar to her art. She greeted us with cool reserve. "You are Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson. I've read of you. You come about the Ashworth affair." Holmes inclined his head. "We do, Miss Harbury. I understand you were once employed by Lord Ashworth." "I was, as a music tutor to Lady Beatrice, though in truth, my lessons were more often attended by her husband." Her mouth tightened. He fancied himself a composer. "I assisted him. Holmes repeated. She laughed bitterly. "He stole from me, Mr. Holmes. That waltz you've no doubt heard. It was mine. My melody, my heart. He claimed it as his own and called it a gift to his wife." A Watson's pen paused in mid-scribble. Holmes said softly, "You speak with bitterness. Miss Harbury, were you fond of him?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Once. But love curdled to loathing when I saw what he truly was. He begged me to write another piece. Something that might wash away his sins," he said. I thought him mad. Now I see he meant it literally. "You encoded his confession," Holmes said.
"Yes,"
she whispered. "He told me everything. How he killed his brother in a quarrel over inheritance. How Beatrice knew and kept silent. He swore he wished only to leave her a message of remorse, hidden in music so only she would understand. I warned him it would bring ruin. He insisted." Holmes regarded her keenly. "And Crane? Crane helped me build the box to contain it. When Edward was found dead, I destroyed my sketches and fled London. I thought the matter buried, until I read of the professor's death." Her composure faltered then. "Was it Hollins who killed him?" Holmes shook his head. "No, Miss Harbury. Hollins died before the professor. Someone else remained, someone who feared your secret might yet emerge. Who visited you after the murder?" She hesitated. "A woman, veiled. She said she represented the Ashworth estate. She offered me money to surrender all remaining copies of the composition. I refused. She warned me that silence was safer." Holmes's eyes darkened. "That woman was Lady Beatrice Ashworth." Miss Harbury's face blanched. "Then she—" "Yes," Holmes said quietly. "The final movement of this tragedy is hers. We left her lodgings as dusk fell over the city. The gaslights flared through the mist, their glow reflecting upon puddles of rain. Holmes walked briskly, his long stride carrying him through the throng. You see it now, Watson. The circle complete. Edward killed his brother. Beatrice commanded Hollands to silence Edward. Crane built the box to preserve the truth. Lytton stole it and paid with his life. And now the woman who began it all seeks to erase every trace of her guilt. And Miss Harbury? I asked. She is both witness and victim, Holmes replied. The truest composer, of melody and of ruin. He stopped before a lamppost and turned toward me, his face grave. This case, Watson, is no longer about justice. It is about absolution, and that is a currency none of us may afford. The following morning, Holmes received a note delivered by hand. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, tremulous. Massacre. Holmes, come to the manor tonight. I have one final truth to share. Alone. Beatrice Ashworth. Holmes read it twice, then passed it to me. A summons, and perhaps a trap. Yet we must go. The coda approaches. We reached Ashworth Manor at twilight. The house stood silent, its windows like hollow eyes. Lady Beatrice awaited us in the music room, her face drawn but strangely serene. Monsieur Holmes, she said softly, I have little time. The constables will soon come for me, I think. But before they do, I must tell you, I did not send the box to you to conceal my crime. I sent it to end it. Holmes regarded her with cool compassion. Explain. I have lived with that melody for a year, every night hearing it in my dreams. When the clock struck midnight, it played, whether wound or not. I thought it madness. Then I realized it was conscience. She gestured toward the piano. I wrote a new arrangement, my own confession. Would you hear it? Without waiting for reply, she sat and began to play. The melody that filled the room was no longer waltz but elegy, a lament of piercing sorrow, tender and terrible. Each note seemed to tear itself from her soul. When the final chord faded, she rose slowly, tears glimmering upon her cheeks. I killed him, Mr. Holmes. With words, not with hands. I told Hollands what he had done, and that I wished him dead. The rest followed as naturally as breathing. She turned away. I wrote this to silence the other song, but it cannot be silenced. Perhaps it never should. Holmes bowed his head slightly. You have spoken truth at last. That is all that remains. As we departed, I saw her place a small vial upon the piano. She smiled faintly when she caught my glance. Don't trouble yourself, Doctor. I have one final note to play, and it must be mine. We left her to the music and the moonlight. That night, as we journeyed back to London, Holmes said quietly, the true composer of this tale, Watson, was never Edward, nor Crane, nor Harbury. It was Beatrice. She orchestrated love, guilt, silence, and death, until the entire house became her symphony. He stared out into the fog. The music box merely played what her heart had already written. When at last the tale of the Ashworths drew toward its conclusion, I found myself filled with a melancholy that I could scarcely name. It was not the triumph of justice, nor even the satisfaction of truth uncovered, that haunted me, but rather the quiet ache of lives shattered by pride, love, and secrecy. 3 days after our final visit to Ashworth Manor, a telegram arrived at Baker Street. It bore the crest of the local constabulary. Lady Beatrice Ashworth, deceased. Apparent suicide. Consumed poison during the night. Music heard from piano at time of death. Holmes read the message twice, then folded it with deliberate care and placed it upon the mantel. For a long time he said nothing. The winter sun struggled weakly through the fog, casting pale bars of light across the sitting room. The violin lay untouched by the window, and the faint scent of tobacco clung to the air like memory. At length Holmes spoke, his voice quiet. It is over, Watson. The melody has found its final cadence. We journeyed once more to Surrey for the coroner's inquest. The manor stood as before, tall, silent, and watchful beneath its shroud of ivy. Inside, the air was heavy with the odor of wilted flowers and candle wax. Lady Beatrice lay upon a chaise in her music room, her hands folded upon her breast, a faint smile upon her lips. Upon the piano rested a single sheet of music, her own composition. Holmes lifted it carefully. Across the top, in delicate script, she had written, the final note. Below, the music unfolded in a slow, mournful progression, and in the final measure, a pattern of notes unlike any other, marked in red ink. Holmes's keen eyes narrowed. A cipher, he murmured. We retired to the study, where he placed the sheet upon the table beside the 2 music boxes. His thin fingers traced the red notes. She has left us a message, Watson. Not of guilt, but of understanding. He took up his violin and played the final measure aloud. The phrase was brief, 4 notes, rising then falling. Holmes stopped abruptly. Do you hear it? The same 4 notes that began the first waltz, but reversed. Her way of closing the circle. I felt a shiver. Then the confession. He nodded slowly. Complete. The entire melody, Edward's, Crane's, Harbury's, hers, was never meant to accuse, only to atone. A requiem written by 4 souls bound in sin. When the constables had concluded their inspection, Holmes requested a moment alone in the music room. I remained at the door as he approached the piano and the boxes resting upon it. For a time he stood there motionless, as though listening to some sound beyond human hearing. Then, with infinite care, he opened both boxes and set them playing together. The twin melodies rose and intertwined, the original waltz and its mournful inversion, weaving a strange and solemn harmony. The effect was almost supernatural. It was as though two voices long estranged had at last found each other in death. When the music faded, Holmes closed the lids. "Let them rest, Watson. This house has sung its final song." We returned to London that night, the fog rolling thick and low across the river. Holmes spoke little on the journey. He sat with his head bowed, fingers steepled, the faint rhythm of the train perhaps echoing the pattern of the music that now lingered between us. At last, as the lamps of the city drew near, he said quietly, "Do you know, Watson, there is a peculiar cruelty in truth. We chase it as though it were salvation, only to find it cold and indifferent when caught." I looked at him. "And yet, Holmes, without it, what are we?" He smiled faintly. "Dreamers, perhaps. Happier ones at that." He turned to the window, watching the blurred lights of the city drift past. Beatrice Ashworth in her final act composed not a confession but a kind of peace. Her death was her resolution, the inevitable final note to a symphony written in blood. He was silent a moment, then added, almost to himself, "There is no harmony without dissonance, no truth without pain. Humanity, Watson, is forever both composer and instrument of its own sorrow." When we reached Baker Street, the hour was late. The fire had burned low, and Mrs. Hudson had left a lamp upon the table. Holmes placed the folded sheet of Beatrice's music beside his violin and poured himself a measure of brandy. He raised the glass slightly. "To the Ashworths, and to all who sought forgiveness through the fragile art of sound." I joined him, though my heart was heavy. As I later wrote in my notes that evening, it seemed to me that no melody, however beautiful, could drown the echoes of such tragedy. Yet when Holmes took up his bow and drew it once across the strings, the single, trembling note that filled the room carried something beyond sorrow, something like understanding. It hung in the air for a moment, perfect and still, before fading into silence. Epilogue. Weeks later, I passed the window of a small music shop near the Strand and stopped short. There, displayed among the instruments, was a familiar object, a wooden music box, its brass key gleaming in the gaslight. I entered at once. "Where did you acquire that?" I demanded of the shopkeeper. He smiled. "A gentleman sold it this morning, sir. Said it was from a fine old house down Surrey way. Plays a haunting tune, doesn't it?" He wound the key, and the melody began. The same waltz, soft and sorrowful, the very one I had hoped never to hear again. I left the shop at once, the sound following me into the fog, fading only as the noise of the street swallowed it whole. And even now, when London lies quiet beneath its veil of mist, I sometimes fancy I can still hear it, that sad, eternal refrain of guilt and grace, rising faintly from the depths of memory.